Hello everyone, and welcome to Autocrat, and this is a bonus episode where we are delighted to be joined by Daniel from Eastern Roman History. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Hello everybody, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So we will be discussing some of the worst Byzantine emperors in all of history. So this is part 2 of a collaboration with Daniel, and on his channel we have hosted a discussion about the best Byzantine emperors. Well, now it's time to see how not to run a state.
Finest example of Roman nincompoops we can find.
Exactly. So I suppose for those who don't know, as a quick question to start us off, Daniel, what does the term Byzantine mean, and is there a distinction between that and Roman?
Well, in a very literal sense, the word Byzantine simply means someone from the city of Byzantium.
Yep.
The original Greek town that was built on the Bosphorus by a guy called Byzas. Its usage today to refer to the Byzantine Empire comes from the 16th century, when a chap called Hieronymus Wolff was editing together manuscripts from Byzantine histories and so forth, and wanted a term to be able to distinguish them from the classical Romans, so people like Hadrian and Cicero, and also the Greeks and so forth. So, as if you just called them the Greeks, then you also have the problem of, is this Aristotle or is this John Zonaras? So it was kind of birthed out of a need to differentiate them. But it's a very academic term, and it's not one the Romans used themselves, unless in its original context of someone from Constantinople. But otherwise, they were all Roman citizens. They're from the Roman Empire. There's no distinguishable break between the Roman Empire of Augustus and the Byzantine Empire of Constantine XI.
Right. So I guess it's an arbitrarily drawn division, sometimes with Constantine the Great, sometimes when the Eastern Roman Empire is on its own without the West, but it's not a distinction that would have been used at the time. It's purely academic and modern.
Yeah, there are other comparisons you could make, like the Franks are the ancestors of the French and the Anglo-Saxons are the ancestors of the English. Despite the fact that the Anglo-Saxons themselves in the 10th century and onwards started calling themselves the Kingdom of the English, the Anglorum. But we still make that differentiation between Norman England and Anglo-Saxon England, despite them continuing to call themselves English or French or so on. So it does have its uses, but it's an entirely academic one.
Okay, well, with that bit of technical definition building out of the way, I suppose we're ready to move on to the very worst of the Byzantine emperors, at least by our arbitrary definitions. So, the first individual I wanted to discuss is more of a quick potential honorary mention, because he's not as bad as some of the famously terrible examples we'll be talking about later in the episode. But this is Michael V, emperor from 1041 to 1042, and he was the adoptive son of the Empress Zoe, the last of the Macedonian dynasty, who had ruled since 867. So he was essentially the last representative in terms of raw number of generations of this dynasty. And he was made emperor when Zoe's husband Michael IV died in 1041, and my impression is that Zoe essentially agreed to this after the fact as a sort of fait accompli. And the year after his elevation, Michael accused Zoe, his adoptive mother, of attempting to have him poisoned, and she was banished to a nunnery. But this was very unpopular with the people, so Zoe was shown off in the hippodrome to show she was still alive, but couldn't hold any power. But Theodora, Zoe's sister, was then secured as essentially a rival nominee for power. Michael tried to run away as there was fighting in the city, but he was eventually caught, blinded, and sent to a monastery. Now, the reason I bring him up is because his adoptive mother Zoe had previously tried to give her previous husband Romanos III an heir, supposedly, according to our source Michael Psellos, by using talismans. And when she became sole empress in 1058, she was already in her 50s and had never had any children. So, in a sense, by that point, Michael V was already the last hope of the Macedonian dynasty, and in its absence, you get the crisis of succession that happens in the 11th century. So I essentially wanted to ask you almost a philosophical question. Do you think Michael would deserve to be on a list of worst emperors for that reason?
I think the big trouble with Michael V is that he has essentially been handed the throne.
Yeah.
As you say, because Michael IV, the Paphlagonian, was dying because he had quite serious epilepsy.
Right.
And this was leaving him very weak and also prone to illness and so forth. But it was very debilitating and he was basically dying. And his brother, John the Orphanotrophos, was basically trying to find a way for him to secure the Paphlagonians in power while also not disturbing the rule of the empresses with Zoe. So it was a kind of compromise that his nephew Michael would become emperor. And I think John was hoping he could control Michael. That's what Michael Psellus seems to imply. But Michael V had different ideas. And in fact, his first action is to get rid of John. And I think if that was the only thing he had done, he would have actually been able to hold on to power and carry on and potentially had some sort of a career as emperor. But he went too far by having Zoe deposed as well. And I think an important context is that not only was the Macedonian house seen as the imperial house by this point, in that this dynasty had ruled the empire for nearly 200 years by this point, but also in many other examples of other families taking the reins of power, like Romanos Lekapanos, Nikephoros Phocas, and John Tzimisces. They had all made very strong attempts to try and maintain the Macedonian house without deposing them and try and get their household into power without disturbing anything. Michael was not doing that. He was trying to depose the Macedonian dynasty outright. I would almost describe the revolt of Theodora as a revolution. You have Michael who's trying to overthrow this whole Macedonian dynasty and bring in his new order, and then you have Theodora, and who's actually incredibly popular and supported by a lot of nobles and also commoners in Constantinople. There's a huge backlash against this, and there's fighting in the capital. Lots of people die in the fighting. Michael is chased out and eventually blinded.
Yeah.
So I think it's that he goes a step too far, and he didn't necessarily need to do it either. But I think because he took that step, you do have to wonder whether he was really a competent emperor, if he was, or maybe not very politically savvy, because he was deposed in 2 or 3 months after taking power, because I think Michael IV died quite late in 1041.
Yeah.
So his actual reign is a bit shorter than it looks. It's only a few months. So I do think Michael V is not a very good emperor. I don't think he's one of the worst, because he didn't really do anything. But yeah, it's not great.
Yeah. I suppose it's a condemned middle road in history, not remembered as truly terrible nor truly great.
Yes, they've forgotten.
Exactly. I think it's definitely a lesson that prudence and being politically savvy are part of being an emperor.
As I say, if he had stopped with John the Orphanotrophos, he could have carried on, and then the Paphlagonian house would have just continued through him, because he would have been able to marry and then carry on his house. That didn't happen.
Well, I suppose that brings us quite handily to the next part of our discussion, who is an emperor we've both suggested independently as someone who should be on this list, and that is Constantine X, who is a little ways into the anarchy after the demise of the Macedonian dynasty. So, would you care to introduce who Constantine is?
Constantine Ducas was a Anatolian nobleman who had some military experience. He had supported Isaac Comnenus in his civil war against Michael Bringas. He floats around the circles of power in the early 11th century, and he finally becomes emperor when Isaac Comnenus abdicates after a near-fatal illness, and Constantine Ducas, who is a supporter of his and probably acquainted with each other, takes his place. That's us in a nutshell. But we both agree that he's easily one of the worst Byzantine emperors.
Yeah. It's not a great moment to get unanimity on your side.
No. Why is he one of the worst emperors? Well, in a sources way, unfortunately, we don't know as much detail as we would like for his reign. But there's a lot of things that we are told about it which are quite damning. So, for instance, he starts demobilizing large numbers of veteran soldiers to make military cuts and demobilize significant portions of the army.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that in this period, and in fact throughout the 1050s, this is a period where the military pressures on the empire are increasing. You've got the Normans in southern Italy, which are a significant threat to Roman power there. In fact, it's probably the most significant threat there since the arrival of the Arabs or Lombards in a couple of centuries before. There's a massive invasion by the Oghuz Turks in the Balkans in the 1060s, which tore around the Balkans, causing mayhem and burning and looting stuff. And the army that is sent to stop them is defeated. And the Oghuz threat mainly solves itself because most of them die of disease and short supplies. So Constantine X does get a bit of flack for that, because when the Oghuz Turks are approaching Constantinople, people are like, go on, Constantine, do something. And he doesn't. And then especially in the east, you've got conflicts with the Arabs in Syria and Aleppo, but you also have the rising threat of the Turks. And in fact, in 1064, you have the sack of Ani, where the Seljuk Turks destroy the capital of Armenia, which is a major city in the area. There's probably tens of thousands of inhabitants, and the city is completely destroyed. And actually, we have a good account of what happened, where you have an official from the capital who's gone there to start making military cuts and things. And you also have him squabbling with the military commander who is there, and the troops, the Armenian and Roman troops who are there to defend the city, start to lose heart, and there's big morale issues. And as a result of this, the Turks don't have too many issues breaking into the city, and then it gets completely destroyed. So yes.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing is endemic in accounts from Constantine X's reign, where you have these really poorly thought out cost-cutting measures put in place, and the security of the empire suffers because of it. I can think of a couple of other examples as well. So there's one where Nicephorus Botaniates, who's the governor of Antioch, and he has a very small army and he needs reinforcements. And he mainly has to rely on his own retinue to deal with the Arabs who are attacking the area. And he's sent reinforcements by the government, but they're not very well trained. They've been very poorly equipped. And after only a few months of campaigning, he has to disband them because a lot of them have died or just deserted or no longer useful. So it's not going very well.
Yeah, it's not brilliant, and I think how Constantine handles his succession plan is also not with the kind of thinking ahead mind that the empire needs at this point. So he dies in 1067 and makes his wife Eudokia promise not to remarry and that nobody except his sons should be called emperors. However, his son is Michael VII, who is emperor at 19 years old, but is noted as being so weak or feeble, or however you want to call it, that his mother is still essentially his regent, which, from the perspective of the empire, a 19-year-old emperor with a regent doesn't scream the confidence and glory that it needs at this moment in time.
Yeah.
Eudokia obviously does remarry to the future Romanos IV, but that series of events leads up to the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, which is considered a turning point for the empire. But from the perspective of Constantine, I would say this adds to why he's not seen as a great emperor, because there isn't really, unlike with his predecessor Isaac, the idea of the empire's needs should come first. He's very focused on his dynasty, which is brilliant from a clan point of view, but not from the perspective of the entire empire.
I think it's very telling that if you go from the relative stability that Isaac has managed to bring back into being in 1059 to 1067, where Eudokia's marriage with Romanus is seen as kind of a emergency measure.
Yeah.
The sources also make it clear that Eudokia does like Romanus, but her decision is also strongly because she needs someone to go out and lead the armies. In fact, perhaps a endpoint of Constantine X's military cuts is quite a well-known passage in Michael Italiotes, where Romanus summons the soldiers of the theme of Anatolia, or Cappadocia. They assemble, and they're this motley crew with pitchforks and tattered old shields, and none of them have got any armour, and so forth. And although it's sometimes interpreted as these being the theme soldiers, as in these are sort of the soldier-farmer troops, there's no real evidence to say that they are necessarily. And that I think it could be more accurate to say that these are in fact the same Tagma theme troops that Constantine had dismissed several years earlier, which I think makes a bit more sense in the 11th century context, where the difference between Tagma and theme soldier had kind of disintegrated. We don't really know a lot about it, but Romanus IV has a significant challenge to try and rebuild the army. And although it's only 8 years, it is amazing how quickly one can get out of shape if you're a soldier.
Absolutely.
But yes, I think Constantine X is largely responsible for the difficulties that the empire has, internally speaking, in the end of the 1060s and 1070s.
Yeah. It reminds me a bit of Commodus' story, not quite in the sense of the specific events, but the premise of there is promise shown in the reign that came before, and that promise is wasted, in a sense, in the current reign. And from the description you've given of soldiers with pitchforks and generally a dilapidated appearance, I'm sure people like Trajan would have been rolling in their grave.
Yes, I mean, in this part of Italiotes' history, he does make the comparisons like how far the legions of old have fallen, or something like that. It's very rhetorical, which is, well, probably intentional, but also it does paint a bit of a picture about what's happening. Constantine's focus during his reign is sort of judicial, and he does actually make some territorial gains in the Caucasus against the Georgians.
Right.
Is interesting, but as a whole, and as you said, the dynasty he establishes is quite long-lasting for the 11th century, but yes, on the whole, is a terrible emperor.
Absolutely. Well, in terms of our next emperor, I was thinking I could roll us back a few centuries and that we could talk a bit about Phocas.
Okay.
So, Phocas, for context, reigns between 602 and 610, so when the empire still has possession, or possession, quote-unquote, as you'll see in a bit, of North Africa and the Middle East. And he reigned just after the Justinian dynasty, and was in fact the reason for its ending, because he beheaded the Emperor Maurice and his 5 sons, and displayed their heads. So the reason for this being that his troops had revolted against Maurice when they were ordered to winter beyond the Danube, and Maurice was unable to quell this uprising. Now, this did cause a very immediate issue for the empire in the sense that the Persian emperor, Khosrow II, who had been friendly to the emperor Maurice in previous decades, claimed that he was in possession of the emperor's eldest son, Theodosius, who was said to have lived. Now, Phocas did send an ambassador over to the Persians, but the man was arrested, and we then get a war between Persia and the Roman Empire, which lasts until, I believe, 628, and is the final big conflict between the two empires. So, throughout this whole conflict, and throughout his whole reign, in fact, Phocas doesn't really handle himself very well. He burns his general Narses alive, or at least his brother persuades Narses to come out from where he's hiding, promising him all sorts of things. And Narses had been so scary to the Sasanian Persians that Persian children were taught his name in a bogeyman style. So you can imagine Persian families in the 600s saying, make sure you go to bed early or Narses will come and get you. And you can imagine that from a war perspective, getting rid of one of your most terrifying generals, presumably because of his success, is not exactly sustainable as an emperor. The Persians then go on to conquer Mesopotamia and Syria, as well as the fortress city of Dara, and I believe actually get as far during the course of the war as Carthage in modern-day Tunisia, so the east of the empire just appears to be falling away, and during the course of his reign, there is a lot of beheading and torturing and other cruelties assigned to him by our main source for the time, Theophanes. And eventually, Phocas does fall because the governor of Africa, Heraclius, sends his son, also called Heraclius, over to Constantinople, and Phocas is dethroned. But I think it's fair to say, although Heraclius will go on to, albeit temporarily, retake the eastern lands, Phocas's reign is far from enviable in terms of its results.
Yes, he does fit the mould of a tyrant.
Exactly.
Quite well. There's, can't remember his name, but there's one chap who he executes, which is just so horrific that almost beggars belief. But he basically annihilates everyone related to Maurice in the years after taking power.
Yeah.
I think one of the big issues for Phocas is the Heraclean revolt, where not only does he have to try and fight Heraclius the Elder in North Africa, but also Heraclius's relative also leads an army into Egypt, and there's major fighting there. And Phocas has to pull troops away from the Eastern Front to deal with it, which is where the main collapse of the frontier starts to happen in the East.
Yeah.
After they start pulling troops away from the front. So, ironically, the Heraclean revolt is kind of one of the big reasons why the Persians are able to start making ground in the East. But I think Phocas does demonstrate that he really struggled to, A, assert his legitimacy and his authority to be able to rule the empire. And his method of doing so was very straightforward, let's say, which just kind of made people hate him more. That's all I have to say about him, really.
Yeah. It's far from ideal as a reign, and the general sense I get from Theophanes is just of incredible cruelty, which, if you are an emperor, it's a good idea to keep the populace on side, which you will not be doing with that level of cruelty, including to Maurice's wife Constantina and their daughters, which I'm assuming, and you might know more about this, with the sensibilities of antiquity, that might be seen as even worse than going against Maurice's sons, given that these are specifically his wife and daughters.
Yes, well, because I think he has them all executed.
I think he does, yeah.
Which, it is quite shocking, that sort of thing. I mean, it's not unheard of to have imperial women eliminated, like Constantine and Licinius have all of the relatives of the other tetrarchs eliminated, which includes women as well. But that's more of an exception than the rule.
Yeah.
And then looking later in the 7th century, you have Valentine, who it's too much for him to actually kill the Empress Martina. He has to maim her instead.
Yeah.
Which is probably a much better example because it's more contemporary.
Yeah.
So when Focus is just kind of executing everyone left, right, and centre, it does seem to be trampling over people's sensibilities a lot more.
Yeah. Especially seeing as he kills Constantina and her daughters on the same spot where Maurice and his sons were executed, which feels very purposefully sadistic or cruel as a spot to go to, and probably symbolises his attitude toward people who he deems a threat to his reign quite well.
No, it just doesn't go very well for Focus, but
no.
I think also it's quite telling that I think his brother turns against him as well eventually.
I think it's his son-in-law Priscus as well. I don't know if that's someone separate.
Thank you. Who turns against him. So I think with a lot of the more tyrannical emperors, or emperors which are on the losing side, so like Michael V, his uncle Constantine stays with him and faces the music with him. And also Justinian II's generals stay with him when they're about to get captured and punished. Whereas I think with Focus, you don't have the same sort of thing. You have a lot more jumping ship.
Yeah. It's a difficult legacy he leaves behind for Heraclius to deal with.
Which, well, as I said, it's because Focus is a tyrant, and then Heraclius the Elder rebels against him, which causes Focus to respond, denuding the east, which means the Persians start to pour in. You then have Heraclius who has to pick up the pieces and then spends the next 16 years doing that. It's a very difficult time.
Absolutely.
To put it mildly. Shall I carry on with one of mine?
Yes, please do.
So, I thought I would follow on with Constantine X with his son and successor, Michael VII, who I think was even worse than he was. And I think we've already touched a little bit upon his enormous capabilities with still needing a regent despite being considered an adult. I can only think of two emperors that needed that, Michael VII and Arcadius. So his reign really starts to get going after Romanus IV loses the Battle of Manzikert, which leads to a civil war between Michael VII and Romanus, which Romanus loses. But once Romanus has been defeated, then Michael starts to, now there's this massive gap in the Roman frontiers, which the Turks start pouring into. And Michael does send a expedition to try and plug it up, but there's a revolt by the Norman mercenaries in this army, and then they start rampaging around Anatolia as well. This is led by a guy called Rusul Baliol, who starts to carve out his own little state. And Michael, his main priority in Anatolia is not the Turks streaming in and pillaging everything in their path, but it's Rusul Baliol and his Normans. And to this effect, he sends an army which is defeated, and then Rusul proclaims Michael's uncle, Caesar John, as emperor, as almost an insult to him, which steals Michael's resolve to destroy this Norman interloper even more. He makes an alliance with the Georgians to get troops to defeat the Normans, which also fails because he can't pay them all, and they just desert. And then the Normans come along and finishes off the rest of the Roman army. And finally, Michael's brilliant solution to the Norman problem is to get the Turks to fight him. And sends out a wide-eyed Alexius Comnenus into Anatolia to do this, which he does, and in exchange for defeating Rusul and handing him over to the imperial government, the Turks are allowed to keep hold of the lands they've taken, and then that seems to be it. Michael's done with Anatolia. And the irony is, Roussel and his Normans have been going around carving a little statelet in northern Anatolia, and kind of, if you pay us, we will keep the Turks away. And so with Roussel gone, all of these areas suddenly get conquered by the Turks, and we don't hear from them again. So Michael obsessing about the Normans seems to have been very counterproductive in a way. He leaves Nicephorus Britanniates to look after the Anatolian theme, and his interests are also taken up by a major Bulgarian revolt in the Balkans, which he does successfully deal with. Something that Michael VII and his court are particularly good at is diplomacy. So they're starting to make arrangements with the Pope for some sort of expedition into the Middle East. He's got relations with Georgia. He marries a Georgian princess, Maria of Alania. He even has a diplomatic contact with China. On the diplomatic front, he has got some credence. But not only is the situation worsening in Anatolia, but after the Bulgarians have been defeated in the Western Balkans, we also have a series of revolts that happen. So there's the revolt of a guy called Nestor in the Northern Balkans, where the Pechenegs ally with this chap called Nestor, and then they go down, burning and looting as they go, and they get to Constantinople and then head back again. So although it's not a big existential crisis, the Romans have essentially lost control of the northeastern Balkans, where the Pechenegs have been settled in Roman territory, which isn't good. And also there are other revolts. So there's the revolt of Nicephorus Prienios in the Western Balkans against the rule of Michael, and he starts leading an army westward towards Constantinople. And also you have a revolt in Anatolia where Nicephorus Britanniates, who, after being refused request for more help, decides to revolt as well. And he leads a small army with the help of the Turks and also the Anatolian nobles to Constantinople as well. And he's the one that deposes Michael. So things aren't going very well. Also, there's a big internal problem, which is caused by Michael, also particularly his minister called Nicephorus, who's a eunuch. Nicephorus has a few plans. So he is responsible for reconstituting the immortal tagmata, which forms the bedrock of the Roman army in the 1070s after it's mutilated itself in the civil wars in the 1070s and then fighting the various enemies cropping up around the empire. But there's a monopoly on the grain supply, which Nicephorus introduces to try and get more money for the state. There's a clearinghouse which is built in a place called Rhydestos. This completely destroys the grain supply to Constantinople because the people selling the grain are being sold short. So they're being paid less for their grain, so the price collapses, but also the grain which is being sold in places like Constantinople is also much higher because there's no competition. And so the people in Constantinople and the hundreds of refugees which are now there can't afford to buy food, which has the direct result of causing a famine, which isn't very good. Funnily enough, the granary is one of the things that Nicephorus Prienios' troops destroy on their way to Constantinople. So that's not good. Also, the government is debasing the currency to try and pay for everything. So the solidus decreases in value quite significantly. And Michael gets the nickname minus a quarter because the price of a measure of grain goes up by a quarter of a solidus. So one solidus pays for 1 quarter less of grain under his reign, which is also not very good. And you also get reports of areas farmland falling into disuse in Anatolia. The jetties of Constantinople get seized by the government to try and help pay for things. there's a lot of fiscal trouble happening. And it's clear that Nicephorus is trying lots of ideas to try and solve this issue. But with the granary and Rhydestos, it quite significantly backfires. And Nicephorus is particularly hated by everyone. In fact, once Michael VII has been deposed, the partisans of Nicephorus Spartaniates go out of their way to have him tortured and executed, despite Spartaniates not wanting this to happen. So his minister gets a lot of blame for it. But also something that the source John Skylitzes says is that Michael is not really educated about how to deal with any of these issues, which maybe explains a little bit about Michael's character. Suffice it to say, everything goes very, very wrong in Michael VII's reign.
Absolutely.
And perhaps less so the Battle of Manzikert in itself, and more the 7 years that Michael is emperor, and his approach is probably more responsible for the dire straits that Nicephorus III and then Alexius I find themselves in the late 11th century.
Yeah.
Where things have got so bad that the actual existence of the Roman state is in doubt.
Yeah. It's also impressive that I think Michael actually manages to cause problems after he's abdicated, and I think even died as well, in that the Normans support a monk, I think called either Reichtor or Rakitor, I can never remember which way round it is, as claiming to be Michael VII, and so the Normans will end up invading because of this during the reign of Alexios I.
Yes.
It's quite impressive.
That's quite correct, because Robert Guiscard has this fake Michael VII.
Yeah.
Who he's reclaiming the throne for.
Yeah, and everyone's so happy about it.
Yes.
It's impressive to keep being a problem after your death. But I think
one of the emperors we'll get to is even a problem when he's still alive.
Yeah.
We'll come to him.
I think Michael's reign is also just more impressive because of setting up future reigns. For example, during the course of the reign, we name-dropped Alexios Komnenos and Nikephoros Votaniates, both of whom do go on to become emperors immediately after Michael. So you're sort of left looking into their early stories more than Michael's, in a sense.
And both of them have quite a lot of knowledge of their careers. And Alexios was evidently significantly more successful than Nicephorus III. But
yeah.
Nicephorus III is trying to do things. So he's taking a different approach to Michael. All of his cost-saving measures basically get dropped. But one also does have to wonder if some of them are being dropped because of what Michael has done. It's like Nicephorus gets rid of outstanding debt for everyone. He clears people's debt. And I do wonder if that's related with, you've got lots of people who are suddenly a lot poorer and can't buy things anymore because the price of grain's gone up significantly. The money they're using is worth less. Are they having to take out loans and stuff which they can't pay back to pay for these things? And so there's Nicephorus just doing what makes sense to prevent more economic difficulties. I mean, the cost is that he has to debase the currency even more. But again, I think there's perhaps more nuance for positivity in Nicephorus's actions, whereas Michael's all seem to blow up in his face.
Yeah, it's not a great reign, but then again, that should be expected given the title.
Indeed. Who's next on your worst emperors?
Next, I'm going to talk about Basiliscus. He ruled between 475 and 476, which puts him as part of the Leonid dynasty in terms of the chronology. He is related to them, being the brother of Empress Verina. She was the wife of Emperor Leo I, mother of Ariadne and grandmother of Leo II. Basiliscus was the leader of the assault to take back North Africa. This was during the reign of his brother-in-law Leo I. Carthage was an important source of grain, and its seizure by the Vandals had been seen as a deadly blow to the empire. Leo had sent over 100,000 men to Carthage to take it back. He defeated the Vandals, but he put off the final blow against the city of Carthage. Glazier, king of the Vandals, asked for 5 days' grace in a truce, which Basiliscus accepted. However, he forgot the willingness of the Vandals to fight and how talented Glazier was. The Vandal king sent fire ships to destroy the Roman fleet. Now, Leo had sunk a considerable portion of his Roman wealth into this. After the attack, there was little hope of actually taking Carthage, and Basiliscus retreated to Sicily. He was so hated when he came back to Constantinople that he had to flee to sanctuary in a church. Those loyal to him asserted that he had schemed to save Glazier and crush the last hope of the Western Roman Empire. Fast forward to 474, and the deaths of both Leo I and Leo II. Verina, the wife of Leo I, plotted to make her lover Patricius emperor over Zeno. However, the Senate selected Basiliscus, and Patricius ended up killed. His wife Zionis and his son Marcus were elevated, as you might expect. However, Zionis also had a lover called Armatus. He was made Magister Militum, or Master of the Military, and Zeno for his part ran away. During his rule, Basiliscus also killed his sister's lover and insulted his wife's paramour Armatus. Those who were unhappy appealed for Zeno to come back. Zeno managed to return to Constantinople, exiling Basiliscus and later killing him and his family. Zeno would rule until 491 CE.
So yeah, that's our summary of Basiliscus, and I think the actual focus seems not so much to be on his very short reign as on his disastrous handling of the 468 attack on North Africa. I don't know what your thoughts would be on that.
I would say both are pretty damning.
Yeah.
Really.
It's a contest which one's worse, really.
I mean, if we're just judging him as an emperor, so he comes to the throne with a lot of support. You know, he's got Verina, the empress. He's got the Ostrogothic generals, Theodore Strabo, and also the Isaurian general Ilus on his side. He's got Martus, who's another quite prominent commander, and Courtier on his side. He's got a lot going for him. And he gets rid of Zeno, who's outplayed politically. And within a year, he has lost all of his support. Zeno successfully comes back and deposes him. And you do have to wonder about just how badly he managed to handle that, in that he lost every supporter he had. And the person he deposed him instead. It's almost mind-boggling, and it's not very good, really, as things go. Because, well, lots of other usurpers have successfully taken the throne and not had that happen. It probably says quite a lot about not only the situation Basiliscus was in, because this was a few years after the Carthaginian expedition, which the Eastern Empire was still recovering from financially, but the political and also religious is another factor of it. Handling of the empire is so bad that it just, blows up in his face.
Yeah. So,
he annoys Theodore Strabo because he promised him a military title and he gave it to Armatus instead. Ilus gets annoyed because Armatus got military honours and he didn't. And he executes Verina's lover, which means Verina is also annoyed with no longer trusting him. Then Armatus betrays him immediately. So it's just you really bet on the wrong horse with that one.
Yeah.
And he also, religiously, because the East Empire is divided between Chalcedonianism and Monophysitism this period, and he comes up with a religious policy coming down in favour of one, and then he backtracks, coming down in favour of the other, which just annoys both. And there's quite a influential holy man at the time called Daniel the Stylite, who also turns against Basiliscus as well. So he messed it up.
Yeah. I was going to ask about the religious divide, actually, because obviously this is something that, from our perspective as a linear story, is far in the future, but if I understand correctly, the divide is over how many natures Christ has, whether it's one nature or two natures, and this becomes a very persistent issue during this period of time.
Yes, well, also a few other things, but I'm aware of the divisions, but it's not something I've studied all that much myself.
Yeah.
Just because that's not really my field.
That's
But
understandable.
I do know that, well, as I say, he comes up with a policy in favour of, I think it's Chalcedonianism first. I can't remember which way round it is.
I seem to remember
Just off the top of my head. But he comes down in favour of one of them first, and then flips and favours the other, which both annoys the patriarch and also Daniel the Stylite, both very influential people in church circles. And this is starting to get to a period where Christianity is actually starting to become a political force in the Eastern Empire. That is to say, like Leo I or Marcion, we don't quite know which, is the first emperor to be crowned by the patriarch.
Yeah.
Which had never happened before, never needed to happen. But now you start adding in this importance of the clergy into the imperial office, which Basiliscus screws up. And in a way which a lot of the other emperors in this period didn't manage to. So like Theodosius II was quite deferring to what the religious mood of the time. So like with 2 councils of Ephesus he has, and then you have Zeno later on with his Hernoticon, which is sort of imperial mandate of religious policy, and also Leo I, who comes down on one side, also tries to stop the bishops killing each other. And then Basiliscus manages to completely get both wrong, where he annoys everyone, and also his U-turn, I think, just kind of shows that he's just trying anything at this point, which the bishops see through immediately. I mean, it was a very difficult thing to do, and I don't think any of the emperors in the 5th or 6th century really managed to satisfy everyone, but some were more successful than others.
Yeah.
Basiliscus was not one of them.
No. I think it's a poignant example of how to keep the people you rely on for power happy is very important, and Basiliscus is a good example of what not to do in that respect.
Yes, and I know Zeno had taken with him the imperial treasury, but that was it. Zeno had only a small group of followers and was trapped, besieged in this fort in Isauria, so he essentially had nothing. And through persuading Ilus to join him, and then Amatus joining him, so Theodore Strabo joins him as well, and also Verena eventually, he's gained all the supporters that Basiliscus had when he dethroned him, and just comes back and dethrones him. I am shocked at how rapidly this all happens.
Definitely.
And do you want to talk about the Carthage episode?
Oh, the 468 campaign.
Yes.
Yes, it does seem quite surprising that Basiliscus appeared to have Carthage at his mercy when he showed up with this huge force provided by Leo, and he manages to just completely mess it up by granting them a truce where he didn't necessarily need to. He could just have gone in for the killing blow, but instead let Gaiseric assemble fire ships to destroy his fleet completely. And I think it's telling that when he comes back to Constantinople, he actually has to run for sanctuary because of how hated he is as a result of this. Because Carthage is a very important grain centre, I assume for both East and West. And it had previously been subject to attempts to get it back, such as under Emperor Majorian in the West, only a few years earlier. But it's very impressive how much Basiliscus was given, and how far he managed to fall as a result.
Yeah. Well, Carthage, for the east, it's the Vandal pirates, which are now heading their way and start looting the coastline.
Yeah.
And for the west, it's where all their money comes from. And it's quite telling that after Carthage goes, that's when Valentinian III and his government have some serious economic problems, where he has to start introducing extra taxes on things like wine and stuff just to pay for one legion.
Yeah.
which is in this period about 1,000 men.
Yeah.
So without North Africa, the Western Empire can't pay for itself.
And I suppose in a way it's a what if. Carthage seems to be very full of promise, so getting it back could have changed the Mediterranean world quite drastically, or at least the fortunes of both Western and Eastern Rome. But certainly, given how much resource Basiliscus had at his disposal, it seems baffling as a decision to step back from the initiative and let Gaiseric completely turn the tables.
Yeah, and the legacy of Basiliscus's stupidity reverberates into the next century, because when the Emperor Justinian is talking about leading an expedition to North Africa and to fight the Vandals, John the Cappadocian is very vocal in saying, it's like, we've already done this and it was a complete disaster, let's not do this again.
Yeah.
Which I think is why Justinian's expedition is significantly smaller in size and scale. I think just purely for risk mitigation, because if it did go seriously wrong, which it actually very nearly did, then they wouldn't have had what happened with Leo I and Zeno, where they spend most of their reign trying to recoup the losses from the expedition.
Yeah.
And they can't really do any major offensives against any foreign power until the reign of Anastasius I.
Yeah.
Which is like 20 years later.
Yeah. It also shows that it is possible to take North Africa, because Belisarius does it with far fewer resources at his disposal and just highlights the contrast in ability between the two.
Yes. Or in Basiliscus's case, a lack of ability.
Well, exactly. So, who was your next candidate?
Well, since we're in the theme of short-lived failures, I have Michael I.
Right.
Who might not be the first choice for people, but he's mainly known for three things. The first is relations with the Franks and Charlemagne, which I actually think was probably the most positive contribution of his reign, where he recognised Charlemagne's imperial title, but this also meant that Charlemagne was going to stop trying to push into Venice and the northern Adriatic, so de-escalating a potential conflict between the Franks and Romans, which is good. And he also resolved the Mocian Schism, which was this religious schism in the church between the supporters of the illegal marriage of Constantine VI and the existing marriage of Constantine VI, which Michael resolved by defrocking the priest that married them. So those are two good things. The two bad things, the one, he led a persecution against the Athenians and Paulicians, just unnecessary. And in fact, the patriarch had to step in and was like, hang on, this isn't what I asked for. I just wanted to try converting these people, not to round up loads of them and start executing them, which is what Michael did. Because he was asked to do this, and it's kind of a theme of Michael's reign that people suggest things to him. He executes them very badly and then gets the empire into more trouble, which leads me on to my second and biggest point, is his total incompetence when fighting the Bulgarians. So Michael comes to power in the same year that the Emperor Nicephorus I and his son lose a big battle at a place called Pliska, and large numbers of troops are annihilated, the emperor's killed, his son Stauracius is mortally wounded, and Michael and Stauracius are left to pick up the pieces, and Michael, a few months later, forces Stauracius to abdicate. So he becomes emperor. And then the following year, the Bulgarians start pushing into Roman territory, because the army they annihilated was pushing up into the Bulgarian Empire at this point. And so Michael leads troops to defeat them, but they don't get there in time, and they lose a big city at Mesembria, which gets sacked. But they do have a minor victory later on. And then Michael's next expedition, when the Bulgarians move down into the southern Balkans, into Thrace, is a total disaster, mainly because of Michael, where he assembles all of his troops and then spends a lot of the summer just marching all around Thrace without actually accomplishing anything, which not only makes his troops angry at him, but also uses up a lot of their supplies. And then when they finally meet the Bulgarians in battle at a place called Versinikia, they get into a standoff, and Michael's content to just sit there watching the Bulgarians, whereas his commanders are eager to actually do something. They've got more men. Their troops are as good as the Bulgarians, if not better. Why don't they attack? And so Michael agrees, and the general John Aplakis charges forward with his wing of the army, and Michael does nothing and leaves John Aplakis and his troops to get annihilated. And then Michael flees, and also his other commander, Leo, has to try and escape from the field with his troops. And this is the final straw for Michael. The army proclaims Leo the Armenian emperor, and he marches on Constantinople, and Michael abdicates. And that's the end of him. But the thing that makes Michael so bad is the result of this, in that in the next few years, most of Thrace is lost to the Bulgarians. And these are the gains that the Empire have made in the last 20 years, which all get lost in the next few years. So the Empire made a big comeback in the Balkans. They had annexed Greece. They had started to annex parts of the Eastern Balkans, parts of modern-day Bulgaria, modern-day Macedonia. And then after Pliska and Versinikia, the Romans are kind of stuck in the coastal area of Thrace for the next 100 or so years, where the Bulgarians really take full control of the upper Balkans. So that area of expansion is lost. Also, with the defeat of the army, it leaves the empire in a crisis because the Bulgarians start marching towards Constantinople. And all of their cities and forts along the Thracian frontier get lost. So it leaves the empire exposed, and it causes the empire, after this period of recovery, to suddenly be in a period of crisis once again, which is solved by Leo. But if Michael had actually had a grain of competence, this whole situation could have been avoided. And that's Michael the First.
Yeah. I think the general verdict for the whole Nicephoran dynasty, which he's a part of, is that they're in quite a sorry state. Certainly none of them last particularly long.
You have 3 emperors in 1 year, which doesn't help. So the dynasty only lasts 11 years, but Nicephorus I does quite a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, his military record is not great, but he does make significant steps in reforming the empire internally. So it's finances, he repopulates and takes control over Greece and southern Macedonia. This whole conflict with the Franks, which Michael resolves, is partly to do with Venice trying to break away and stuff like that, and the Franks moving in. So I think in Nicephorus I, if Pliska hadn't happened, we would remember him very differently. But, well, it did. But the rest of his reign is, on the whole, very successful.
Yeah.
It's Pliska, which is the big one, where you have a disaster on a scale like Yarmouk or Adrianople, or, one of the big defeats. And then Versinikia is another one where, in the space of 2 years, you have 2 very significant military disasters.
Yeah. Pliska and Versinikia certainly bring down the grade average.
Yes. I mean, Nicephorus and Pliska was a trap, which admittedly Nicephorus did walk into, but we should give some credit to the Bulgarians for actually setting up this trap and successfully pulling it off. Whereas Versinikia, the Romans should have won that battle. I think a lot more blame could be placed squarely on Michael I's shoulders. I remember, I think Theophanes says, the Bulgarian Khan couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. And it took them a while to actually start pursuing Michael's troops because they were all running away. And he hadn't done anything. Well,
yeah.
Defeated the Roman vanguard, but hadn't done anything. So it's a bit more
Yeah, a bit more damning.
Yes. So, that's Michael the First for me.
Yeah. I don't think I've really got much more to add for him, to be honest. It's quite a sorry state of a dynasty.
He's a very short emperor.
Yeah.
Who have you got next?
Well, I suppose jumping forward about 400 years from the 9th century to the early 13th, we have someone who I suppose we've got a lot more detail for, and this is Alexios IV. So, Alexios is born in about 1178, I believe, as the son of the future emperor, Isaac II, who overthrows the last of the Komnenoi, and Isaac gets ejected from power by his brother, also named Alexios, confusingly, but Alexios III in 1195. Our ruler, Alexios IV, is placed under house arrest, but escapes in about 1201, escaping detection as a sailor on a boat full of Pisans. He then flees to Philip of Germany, his brother-in-law, via his sister Irene, and eventually meets up with someone called Boniface of Montferrat, leader of the Fourth Crusade. So we discussed the crusading movement in part 1, in your part of this collaboration, and this was an initiative first started by Alexios I, but we're now on the Fourth Crusade, and in December 1202, Alexios shows up at Zara and incentivizes the crusade to reinstate him with money, soldiers, and church reunion promises, because we've already had the schism at this point between Catholicism and Orthodoxy as they will become known. Pope Innocent III is not particularly happy with this and asks the crusade not to attack any Christian territories, because I'm sure everyone can agree that for the stated premise of a crusade, which is to attack people who are not Christian, attacking one of the biggest Christian city in Europe is not exactly a brilliant aim. But the crusade gets diverted. Alexios is notably booed when he arrives at the walls of Constantinople, but eventually Alexios III flees the city, and Alexios IV is crowned co-emperor with his father Isaac II in August of 1203. He then hosts the Crusaders in the city at his cost, and holes in the Theodosian walls are made to deter resistance against the Crusaders. However, the situation is not particularly happy because Isaac II can't pay the ridiculous amounts that his son has promised the Crusaders, and a rival called Nicholas Cannabos is briefly elected as emperor but doesn't last very long at all. Someone else, again, called Alexios, this time Alexios V, also known as Murtzopoulos or Monobrow, stages a coup of his own, and eventually Alexios IV is strangled on the orders of Alexios V, and there is a pretense that his death is natural, but the fallout from Alexios IV's death then leads to the sack of Constantinople in 1204, which is a turning point for the empire in terms of not being able to recover from it after the fact. So that's what I've got as a summary for Alexios IV. I would say definitely deserving of being on this list.
Definitely. I mean, he kind of goes hand in hand with my next guy, who is Alexios III.
Oh, yes.
So we could kind of discuss them together, if you like.
Yeah.
Because I would say that you wouldn't have had Alexios IV and the Fourth Crusade without Alexios III in the first place, because ostensibly Alexios IV gets the help of the Crusaders because of Alexios III, who deposed his father, Isaac II. And if you're confused by all of these Alexioses, then don't worry. So am I.
Yeah.
And I think, who has more blame? The person who sets up the empire for the fall, or the person that leads it to it? Which I would argue is probably both of them appeared fairly culpable. I mean, I won't go through the rough of Alexios III's reign, but his resume is not very good. You've got corruption in the government and in provinces. You've got imperial control of the provinces starting to disintegrate, like in Corinth and Philadelphia. We have local potentates starting to take power. You've got territorial losses in the Balkans. You've got court intrigues happening left, right, and centre. There's a coup in 1200 by a man called John the Fat, which is suppressed, but I think exemplifies the instability of Alexius's reign. There's lots of abuses of power where people doing corrupt practices get a free hand under Alexius. Some ways, Alexius himself seems to have no scruples about anything, including blinding his own brother to seize the throne. Because of his usurpation, the war against Bulgaria, which Isaac II was starting to get on top of, loses momentum. And then a lot of Thrace and Macedonia are nearly lost. If there's one good thing to say about Alexius III's reign, he does manage to regain control of the situation in that region. But it's a reign of the worst abuses of power and laziness, and we're talking about the Fourth Crusade. If he had decided to stay and fight, then you may not have had Alexius IV take power and then the spiralling situation in Constantinople. I think there's a reason why the Fourth Crusade happens when it does for the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, that without the significant internal problems and weakness of the empire, then the Crusaders would probably have never had a chance in capturing easily one of the most well-defended cities in the world at that point. And the fact they do, with an increasingly small army, because people were deserting the crusade all the time, because, as you said about the Pope, that people in the crusade are going, why are we attacking this Christian city again? And they go off. They just leave it. And then Alexius IV, once he seized power, he struggles to, as you say, pay the Crusaders. So the whole situation spirals out of control. But I have Alexius III on my list rather than Alexius IV because after the Fourth Crusade, he's also causing mayhem because although he tries to build up support in Greece to retake Constantinople and challenge the Latins, once he comes back, he gets the Turks to help him invade the Empire of Nicaea, which is one of the main successor states of the empire, which nearly destroys the fledgling empire at that point. So not only does he doom the empire once, but he does it again. Do you have any comments to add from Alexius III? What do you think of this dynamic duo of doom?
I definitely think that the Alexioi, if you could call them that, Alexios III and IV, should be considered together, in that Alexios III may have lined everything up perfectly for disaster, but it still needed Alexios IV to tip the final balance. But I do think you're right in that Alexios III does cause a lot more mayhem after the Fourth Crusade, fairly obviously, than Alexios IV is able to, because of his death before the sack even happens. I'd say it's definitely a duo who did not have a good impact on the empire, to put it mildly.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, if that's the Alexioi, who do you have next on your list then?
So I have one last emperor. That is Andronicus II Palaeologus.
All right.
I think is the latest emperor in our list of emperors.
Yeah.
So he ruled from 1282 to 1328.
Wow.
So a very long time.
Yeah.
So I'll start off with some of the good things that he did. So he was quite good with diplomacy with other Balkan states. So at this period, the empire's come back, and it's centered around the Western Anatolian coastline and also the southern Balkans. He mends two religious schisms which had occurred under his father's reign. One with the Arsenites, who were the section of the clergy which opposed the blinding of a boy called John IV, and the Josephites, who were against Michael VIII's active church union. So that's something Andronicus II resolved. He appointed a quite influential and effective patriarch, Anastasius, who was quite a big mover in reforming the church. he conquered northern Epirus and northern Thessaly, and he was quite an important patron of the arts and culture. So, for instance, the polymath Theodore Metachetes was a personal friend and important minister under Andronicus II. So those are some of the good things. However, there's a significantly longer list of bad things. So, for instance, under his reign, half of the empire was lost to foreign attack. So the situation in Anatolia had changed by the end of his father's reign, where lots of Turks were streaming in from Central Asia because of the Mongols, and they were starting to push westward. And eventually Andronicus II goes to this part of the empire himself to set things right. And after one policy and another, they all fail, and eventually this whole half of his empire is almost completely lost by the end of his reign. And there are lots of disasters because of that. So he appoints a very effective governor-general of Anatolia, a guy called Alexios Philanthropenos, who his military successes lead his troops to revolt and proclaim him emperor. And Alexios is betrayed and handed over to Andronicus and blinded. So that doesn't go very well. And then Andronicus appoints less talented people to govern Asia Minor, which means the area starts to lose ground to the Turks. He was very big on trying to make cost-cutting measures. So he would settle people in the empire, but he did it in a way which always seemed to come back to bite him. So Cretan refugees were settled in Anatolia, and these same Cretans who were enrolled into the army are the main people who proclaimed Alexios Philanthropenos emperor, which isn't good. He settled a group of Alans in the empire, who he equipped from the treasury, and they quite frequently desert or revolt while on campaign, so that's not very good. So they start getting into fights with the next big solution that Andronicus comes up with, which is to hire a large mercenary company called the Grand Catalan Company, who are incredibly expensive. They're very good fighters, but there's not enough of them to actually garrison the territory they retake from the Turks. And they also start turning on the Roman inhabitants themselves to extract money, or if there's disagreements, stuff like that. And the Alans also mutiny because Andronicus is paying the Catalans far more than he's paying them. And this blows up quite spectacularly in Andronicus II's face when the Catalan company commander is killed by an Alan, ironically. And then the Catalans go berserk and turn on the empire, and they spend several years in Thrace and Macedonia burning and pillaging everything in their path, which was not the best outcome of that brilliant solution. And I think this whole sort of cheap and cost-saving measures, or like short-term thinking for long-term problems, is quite endemic of Andronicus's reign. So, for instance, he's trying to cut down on the amount the state is spending on military, so he disbands the navy, which is very expensive. However, this leads him into a war with Genoa, where the Genoese are able to sail within shooting range of the walls of Constantinople and burn all of the capital's wharfs, and Andronicus hasn't got any ships to challenge them. And this is where the small settlement next to Constantinople, Pera, or Galata, as it's called, breaks free from the empire after it's given to the Genoese. So there's that. There's also other losses of territory elsewhere. Rhodes is lost to the Knights of St. John. Euboea, a large island off Greece, is also lost. Monemvasia is lost to the Bulgarians. And there's a large expedition which his father had sent to try and conquer the Peloponnese, which also failed. So there's a lot of failures. Also, he has to debase the currency to try and pay for all of this stuff. So you start having the same problems the empire had in the 11th century, where the money is worth less and there's more things to pay for. And, well, with the losses of territory, the government is struggling to pay for its own defense, and then it needs to debase the currency to pay for these things, and so you have this cycle of defeat, debasement, and loss of territory. He also had an issue with corruption during his reign, where there were a lot of officials and judges and things like that who were able to get away with corrupt practices. The measures that Andronicus II had instituted to try and tackle these issues, such as setting up a 12-man corruption tribunal, were ineffective and was unable to curb the abuses that officials were having on the empire. And it gets quite bad where you have people in the countryside that are having to look to bishops and things to get their justice rather than the secular courts, because the secular courts can't be trusted to have a fair verdict. And right at the end of his long reign, because of a family tragedy, he is unable to come to an understanding with his grandson, another Andronicus, which leads to civil war, which Andronicus II loses. And part of the theme of this civil war is the sort of new generation coming in to take charge and inject some new life into the empire, which I think perhaps tells you a bit of how people felt about the character of Andronicus II's reign, that the old guard had failed to do their job. And so it's now up to the new guard to try and improve upon it.
Yeah. From how I understand it, the tragedy in question is that Andronicus III, the grandson of our protagonist, let's call him, ends up arranging for his brother's murder without realising it's his brother, because he knows someone is sleeping with one of his mistresses.
He's in love with this woman, and his brother, who he hasn't realised, is also seeing this woman, and he murders him and then realises what he's done.
Yes, that was it.
Which is not the best thing.
No.
And he gets disowned by Andronicus II because of this. Also, Michael IX, who's the son of Andronicus II and father of Andronicus III, and his brother dies at roughly the same time as well. So,
yes,
as two family tragedies. But again, I think the Civil War didn't happen immediately, and there's attempts at reconciliation happening between both parties. But Andronicus II is unable to achieve that, and there's some court intrigue and things going on, but it's a rather dramatic but unfortunate end to a rather disappointing reign.
Yeah. And my understanding of it is that this theme of generations of the ruling Palaiologos dynasty fighting amongst themselves is not something that's going to disappear in a hurry in the time after Andronicus.
This is the first Palaeologan civil war.
Yeah.
And there are like half a dozen more in the same century that happen afterwards.
Yeah. It's not setting a brilliant precedent for the empire in any way.
No, certainly not. Well, the next one essentially dismembers the empire.
Yeah. Isn't that between John V, so the great-grandson of our current Andronicus II, and his father-in-law John VI?
Yes.
Yeah.
John Cantacusenos. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's another story.
Absolutely.
Yes. But as an emperor, Andronicus II is not a very good one.
It is still impressive that, from my rough calculations, he's managed to reign longer than all our other protagonists, quote-unquote, put together. So he may have had a bad reign, but he had a very long time in which to get it wrong.
Yeah. Well, about 40 years.
Yeah.
He is one of the longest reigning emperors.
Yeah.
There's not many emperors that reign for 40 years or more.
No.
There's Theodosius II, Constantine VIII, if you count all of his reign, and then Basil II.
I'm sure long-lived emperors like Basil II, Constantine VIII, and Augustus would not be particularly thrilled to have Andronicus as their equal, let's say.
Amongst their ranks.
Yeah,
yes.
that's the phrase I was looking for.
Hello, I'm also here. Oh God, aren't you?
He gets a participation award.
Yes. Participation. But yes, it is a litany of disasters.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's something he often had a hand in himself. So,
Yeah.
which is something we mentioned John Cantacousnos, where although the civil war itself destroys the empire, I think there's a blame that has to be pointed at everyone involved. It's not really a single person particularly.
No.
And actually, as emperor afterwards, John VI really tries his best, actually. It's amazing he's even able to accomplish anything. Whereas Andronicus II, he starts quite well. He's got territory in Anatolia, he's got territory in the Balkans. The empire has problems, but things are still on a fairly even keel. And then by the end of his reign, he's lost half the empire, and the other half has just experienced 8 years of on and off civil wars.
No, it's a terrible picture overall.
Who's your last?
Well, it's someone who has not managed to cling on to power for as long as Andronicus II by any means, but he shows us there is a theme of people with the name Andronicus being less than ideal, because it's Andronicus I. So, Cass, do you want to take us through it?
Andronicus was born in 1117 as the son of Prince Isaac and the grandson of Alexios I, who was still alive at the time. He was the nephew of John II and cousin of Manuel I. He was with these two when they campaigned in the east, about around the time of the death of John II, when Manuel rushed back to Constantinople to secure his throne. Andronicus was taken captive by Turks. Manuel did not pay the ransom for him, apparently.
Yeah.
By 1144, so a year later, he is back and governor of Cilicia. While he is governor, Soros II of Armenia takes several regions of the empire for himself. This fight continued in 1151 when Soros invaded Cilicia again. Andronicus was dispatched but was beaten and slung home with his tail between his legs. He then becomes jealous and begins plotting against Manuel around 1153, opening contact with Hungary and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. He is discovered in Manuel's tent holding a knife. He plans also to kill Manuel while hunting, but one of the princes finds out and Manuel is warned. Andronicus then gets sent to jail. He is freed, but his governor position is taken from him. Manuel then imprisons him again for plotting in 1159 or 1160. He is released, once again, in 1162 and made the governor of Cilicia, but is also again imprisoned after Cilicia gets overrun by the Armenians. He finds out that there is a hidden room under his prison tower in Blacherny, a region in Constantinople, and he takes cover inside it. He tries to get out and run away to a ship, but he's taken prisoner. That seems to be a recurring theme with him. In 1164, he escapes after a key is smuggled into him in a wine barrel and flees to the Danube River, ultimately ending up with the Rus, who are enemies of the emperor. Manuel ultimately pardons him and gets him to return home, all the while relations are repaired with the Rus. He later excels when fighting to take the fortress of Zemlin for the emperor. In 1166, Andronicus is made governor of Cilicia again. However, is replaced the following year when Bohemond III of Antioch makes a complaint that he isn't doing what he's supposed to, and is instead sleeping with Bohemond's sister Philippa. He's replaced as governor, but he runs away with Philippa to Jerusalem. He then abandons her and sleeps with the widow of Baldwin III of Jerusalem, his cousin Theodora. He then runs away to the Muslim Nur Eddin for protection. When that person dies, they move to Pontus and are given a place to live by the Turks in the area. In 1180, Manuel takes Theodora and uses her as a bargaining chip to get Andronicus to surrender himself. Andronicus comes dressed in chains and theatrically showing remorse. Manuel pardons him and makes him governor of Pontus.
It feels amazing to me at this point that Manuel is still trusting him.
When Manuel I dies, Alexios II becomes emperor. However, his regents don't get along. The new emperor's sister and husband plot with Andronicus' son against the emperor's dowager and regent Alexios. A riot attacks him, but Andronicus' daughter Maria has the finger pointed at her and she writes to her father. Andronicus gathers an army and people flock to him. The previous players are either sent to the church or blinded. Andronicus becomes regent for Alexius II. He then becomes paranoid, and the emperor's mother is killed when she is accused of allowing Bela III of Hungary to enter the empire and takes the city of Belgrade. Andronicus makes noises he will be retiring if he isn't made co-monarch, and everyone agrees. Alexius II is then strangled and thrown into the Bosporus, although there will be pretenders for quite some time claiming to be him. Andronicus then tries to squash rebellious areas, including tying the mother of one leader called Isaac Angelos to a battering ram, while besieging the city of Phoenicia. When in 1185 a general called Ducas comes back with Isaac, he suffers impaling. There's also attacks by the Sicilians claiming to restore a pretender to be Alexius II during this time. Andronicus orders all his prisoners to be killed, but his son Manuel don't do so, and the mob attacks the prison to free the prisoners. Isaac Angelo escapes arrest when a prophecy says that someone called Aias will be the one to succeed Andronicus. To try and calm the mob down, Andronicus suggests that he can abdicate to his son Manuel, but the rabble storm the palace to make Isaac emperor. Andronicus tries to run away to the Rus, but he is captured, brought back, tortured, and killed in the hippodrome by the mob. His two sons are both blinded, and the eldest Manuel dies. Isaac Angelos becomes Emperor Isaac II. That guy really is something.
It's a very colourful story.
He runs away, gets freed, he gets in prison, runs away again.
Yeah.
And that's all, folks.
Yeah. He must have been very persuasive, though, to get Manuel to reinstate him time after time. So yeah, the general impression I get from Andronicus is a bit like Phocas in that I think he's named with the epithet of the one who hates sunlight because of how many people he had blinded during his reign. And
yes,
yeah, you've made quite a statement if the mob at the Hippodrome are prepared to not only kill you but torture you to death.
Oh, the account of Andronicus I's death is quite horrific, really.
Yeah, that's the impression I get. It sounds pretty horrific.
I won't go over all the grisly details, but like someone throws boiling water in his face, someone cuts his hand off, people throw turds at him, his hair gets pulled out, stuff like that. He's hung up in the Hippodrome, and then two soldiers take shots at who can plunge their sword into him further.
Yeah, it's really horrific stuff.
Yes. However, he probably deserved quite a good bit of it, because he executes quite a lot of people.
Yeah.
And has a lot of other people murdered.
Yeah, a bit like Phocas, although centuries earlier.
Yes, I think those two definitely deserve the title of tyrant.
Yeah. I would say they probably also both deserve the title of dynasty destroyer, but for separate reasons, because Andronicus comes in after the very successful reigns jointly of Alexios I, John II, and Manuel I, who have reigned about 99 years between them. And I know this is alternate history in a way, but Alexios II could have gone on to reign for, who knows, maybe decades longer. And the fact of the matter is that after Andronicus I's reign, the Komnenoi are gone and replaced with the Angelos dynasty, who we had so much to talk about under the Alexios III and IV a while ago.
Yes.
Whereas Phocas is not part of the dynasty he replaces, but does end up destroying the Justinians in a similar fashion.
Yes. I think there's actually quite a lot of points of comparison between the two.
Yeah.
I think the thing which he really falls down on is the Norman invasion, where he fails to stop it, and then the Normans sack Thessalonica, which there's actually a whole account about the sack of Thessalonica by a guy called Eustathius.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's pretty horrendous. But this is also partially Andronicus's fault, because he's so paranoid about a commander rebelling against him that he splits up the army into like 5 or 6 small units, and neither one of them on their own is able to actually challenge the Normans. And so they just have to give ground, which is partly why the mob in Constantinople attack him, because public confidence in him disintegrates.
Yeah.
It's not a very good record. Actually, he does get a point of praise from one of the big sources I called Nikitas Konyatis, because he does try and reform provincial administration and try and clear up corruption amongst the aristocracy and imperial administration. I remember Nikitas saying something like, if he hadn't been like a complete lunatic, he probably would have been quite a good emperor. But yes, unfortunately he was. So no, I completely agree. He's not very good.
No, and I suppose where the army is concerned, commanders such as way down the line, the future Emperor Napoleon I have shown that dividing and conquering is really where an army thrives. So intentionally splitting your army up when they're facing the Normans would seem very counterproductive with that in mind.
Well, the first thing that Isaac does when he becomes emperor is group the army together, and then they immediately have success against the Normans and then kick them out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it is Andronicus's own bloodthirstiness and paranoia which ends up destroying him.
Yeah, absolutely.
His life before is just like, goodness, it's fact is stranger than fiction, almost, because it's just like a roller coaster ride of
absolutely
of adventures and events and reversals and upshots and seductions and weird family relations and stuff like that.
Yeah. It says something for the second half of his reign that even his own son refuses to carry out his orders at some point.
It's a shame about Manuel, isn't it, John? Yeah, Manuel, because he is also killed in the aftermath of Andronicus's deposition.
Yeah. Isn't one of those two, I can't remember which, the ancestor of the Megas Komnenoi who will go on to rule Trebizond until the 1460s?
That's correct. So the sons of Manuel,
yes,
Alexios and David, are spirited away to Georgia by their mother, and they stay there for the next 20 years, and then reappear in 1204.
Yeah. So I suppose it's a good legacy to leave in that sense, but unfortunately, what happens down the line doesn't make up for being a truly terrible person when you're at the helm.
Yes.
And really, I think all of our examples today have shown this quite well. They've all failed in different ways, but all leave advice for aspiring monarchs everywhere on what not to do.
Definitely.
Well, I think that probably brings us to the end of our discussion. So, Daniel, thank you very much for joining us. We've really enjoyed this chat.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And feel free to go and check out Daniel's YouTube channel, Eastern Roman History, where part 1 of this collaboration will be posted.
And be sure to do the same on my channel if you're coming from there.
Yeah. So, thank you all very much for listening, and have a great week, everyone.